Welcome back. As part of the audit planning process, we're required to obtain an understanding of the client's business and the client's industry. So this video will cover why we need to have that knowledge, what type of knowledge is needed, and how the auditor goes about obtaining that knowledge in order to meet our third learning objective. Why we need to understand the client's business and industry is so that we can be effective in our conduct of the audit, so that we can identify and assess the risks of material misstatements and then, of course, respond appropriately to address those risks. So our big risk standard, ACCT90014, says the auditor shall obtain an understanding of the entity and its environment. So there's the mandatory requirement right there, including its internal controls. So internal controls we focus specifically on in a later week, sufficient to identify and assess the risks of material misstatements of the financial statements, whether due to fraud or error, and sufficient to design and perform further audit procedures. In other words, to plan what we're going to do in the audit and then to execute the audit. So why we have to have this knowledge of the client's business and industry? Unless we understand the events and practices and risks of that particular client and that particular industry, we don't know how they're going to affect its accounting balances. So it's the implications for the financial statements, for the transactions, for the account balances and the disclosures. So remember, those are our three categories of assertions: transactions, account balances and disclosures, that we have to audit in the financial report. So that's the reason why we need the knowledge of the client's business and industry, to be able to identify the risks of material misstatements in the financials. What kind of knowledge we need in order to be able to do this? What do we need to know about the client's business and industry? Well, of course, the answer is as much as possible. So we need to obviously know the conditions affecting the relevant industry, regulatory and other external factors such as current micro and macroeconomic factors. That's the industry. Of course, we need to understand the client itself. So how is it structured? What does it actually do? What are its supply chains? What are its key business relationships with? What are its ownership and governance structures? How does it run itself? How does it finance itself? What are the sources of finance? What are its investments? What kind of governance structures does it have in place? What are its strategic objectives and business risks? Now, the next video will talk specifically to business risks, but these are the risks involved in whether or not it meets its strategic objectives. These can have financial statement effects. And of course, from the specific accounting point of view, the knowledge we need to measure and review the entity's financial performance and position. Something we've talked about previously, how we use our analytical procedures to get that overview of the entity's financial position and performance. And of course, we need to know the validity of the going concern assumption. So at the planning stage of the audit, we make our assessment of the validity of the going concern assumption, and we use our analytical procedures, things like our ratio analysis and debt to equity ratios, etc., to come up with our planning stage judgment of going concern. So how does the auditor actually go about obtaining knowledge of the client? Well, of course, a lot of it is down to simply experience. So we can review our industry and business data and knowledge. Most audit firms, particularly those that believe they're industry specialists, do have specialists who spend a lot of time just keeping up with what's going on in the industry in the background. If it's an existing client, of course, we have our past experience with the client, and that past experience will be documented in the past year's working papers or client file. We need to be able to know what are the key contracts that the client has in place, so evidence of their, for example, financing and investment relationships, contracts which evidence maybe future purchase commitments or capital expenditures. As auditors, we're entitled to access to all of the minutes of directors and board committee meetings and so on. Obviously, we need to be physically familiar with what the client actually does with their business premises and their business operations. So this is sometimes referred to as a walkthrough, understanding how and where people are actually operating on the office or the factory floor. Making inquiries of management and the audit committee. At the planning stage of the audit, what we need to be able to do is come up with a list of any related parties, and therefore we plan to be alert to identify any of those related party transactions through the conduct of the audit. Related party transactions are always at high risk of misstatement. They're at high risk of misstatement because they are not arm's length transactions, so they potentially don't have an objective market price to measure. Historically, related party transactions have been a vehicle for frauds and earnings management taking place. And of course, they have a specific accounting standard and disclosure requirements that must be met. We therefore have a matching auditing standard, ASA 550, evidence about auditing related party transactions, to ensure that our presentation and disclosure assertions are fairly stated. Finally, through conducting analytical procedures, as we've talked about a lot, we get knowledge about the financial condition, performance and position of the entity. So if we were to sum up our idea about understanding the client's business and industry, we can say we have a red letter principle for auditors, which is that as the auditor, you should know the client better than they know themselves. The better you know the client, the better you're able to assess the risks, the more able you are to detect material misstatements and therefore provide an effective, high-quality audit. This concludes our discussion of understanding the client's business and industry. In our next video, we'll look down a little bit more and drill down on this concept of business risk.